social mobility does something to people, right? This is a thing that happens to people all of the time to varying different degrees, but it does something to us, right? And we don't talk about it that way. I was able to produce enough data and kind of weave together these student stories to be like, here's one very extreme set of examples of this. But this is part of a larger, bigger thing that is what social mobility is. And social mobility involves an economic, a social, and a cultural component, right? Each of those components work together in a way that there are demands on each level of what they expect of a person of each kind of class status, right? As you like move your way up or down for downward mobility, it's going to change people.
Do you think money takes up more life space than it should? On this show, we discuss with and share stories from artists, authors, entrepreneurs, and advisors about how they mindfully minimize the time and energy spent thinking about money. Join your host, Jonathan Dio, and learn how to put money in its place and get more out of life.
Hey, welcome back. On this episode of the Mindful Money Podcast, I'm chatting with Melissa Osborne, PhD. Melissa is an Associate Professor of Sociology at Western Washington University and an education and organizational consultant. Her primary research centers on social mobility, inequality, stratification, class, culture, and the role that organizations play in shaping individuals' pathways and experiences. Melissa was a first-gen college student from a working-class background that started her academic trajectory as a non-traditional adult learner. We're going to hear a little bit more about that in community college. Melissa is an alumna of the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation and received her AA from Umpqua Community College. I love that word, the bank, Umpqua. I love that word. In 2010, and her BA from Reed College, 2013, MA and PhD from the University of Chicago, 2015, 2019, respectively. I wanted to have Melissa on the Mindful Money Podcast to talk about her book, Polished: College, Class, and the Burden of Social Mobility. Melissa, welcome to the Mindful Money Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, excellent. So first, just before we get into a bunch of stuff, where are you calling in from? Where do you call home?
Yeah, so I live in Bellingham. I'm at Western Washington University. We're just south of the Canadian border. So I'm a Pacific Northwesterner, left for a while for graduate school, but am back here in the trees.
So you grew up there?
I did. I grew up in Oregon, so kind of in regionally similar, but very different kind of place than Bellingham.
Okay. So this may be an odd question to ask of an academic, but again, we try to normalize this conversation around money a little bit. So I'm curious what you learned about money or even entrepreneurship when you were growing up in Oregon.
Oh man, nothing. So I grew up in a working class household in a very rural part of Oregon that at the time, kind of in the 80s, was a lumber industry that was facing a lot of challenges and is now, kind of a dying, completely dead industry. And in fact, all of the lumber mills have left the area that I'm originally from. Yeah. So in my household growing up, we didn't talk about money. Nobody taught me about money. I didn't actually start learning about how money actually works until kind of in the latter half of graduate school. And I still feel like I'm trying to catch up. I do remember in middle school, we had a class where they taught us how to use a checkbook, and that was the extent of it, where they were like, you will need to use a checkbook. We are going to teach you how to do that. But there was no discussion of, the notion of savings or even kind of how to budget for groceries or things like that, let alone the notion of, investing or anything like that.
Yeah. I remember that class actually in middle school. It was a one semester class for me. It was one semester class. It was 1/3, basically how do you balance a checkbook? Yeah. 1/3 was cooking and 1/3 was something else. Maybe it was homemaking or.
Yeah. We had typing as part of our third.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. Very important. All critical skills.
So important.
And that's the sum total of the financial education most of us receive, how to balance a checkbook. Yeah. And nobody balances a checkbook anymore. It's so.
No.
So I'm wondering if you could think back to an experience, not necessarily a class or a dedicated lesson, but an experience you with your parents or you with a parent shopping for groceries or shopping for a pair of jeans that you could take a lesson from, or that you might have taken a lesson from?
I think that kind of growing up, there are a couple of moments when essentially things were presented to me as a choice, right? So it was, we have to go shopping for school clothes, right? You really want this like list of things that you would like to have. We are not going to be able to afford all of those things. And so you need to prioritize what it is that you want, right? My parents were very much so like, okay, you obviously are going to get new socks and underwear and basic things that you need. But if you want, that cooler t-shirt, then you could have the cooler t-shirt or you could have three not cool t-shirts. In later elementary school and then into middle school, that was, kind of the theme of things for me that stuck with me in a way that eventually became pretty helpful, right? Then it's like, oh, you have to actually prioritize and rank things in order of necessity. And the necessity of coolness when you're 12, I definitely, the first year was like, great, I'll have the cool t-shirt and not the three uncool t-shirts. And then very quickly realized, oh no, I don't have enough t-shirts. And so I took the less cool route the following year, And so I think that is something talking about it, I'm having like sensory memory going back to, I think the JC Penney.
Oh yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Well, kudos for you for choosing the less cool route the next year. I don't think many of us learn that lesson that quickly. That's good. So I want to get into the research in the book, but before we do that, can you tell us a little bit about your story? Because it's not really just academic research for you. It's part of who you are. So tell us about your college experience.
Yeah. So I guess to explain my college experience, I have to rewind a little bit. I grew up in this rural small town and series of small towns in Southern Oregon. And I ended up dropping out of school. The last grade that I completed was 8th grade. So I did part of 9th grade, didn't make it all the way through. And then, I did alternative school for a little bit. That didn't work out either. And then I worked, and I, at a certain point was moved up and down the West Coast and ended up back in my hometown. And I was a young single mom and was working in, kind of wage labor jobs. I've worked in factories and in lots of food service and things like that. And I was back into that kind of work and was, very kind of concerned about the future for myself, but mostly for my daughter, right? And it was very like, we're back where I started. This town and this kind of life that we have does not offer a lot of opportunities. And although I hadn't gone to school as long as I was supposed to in K through 12, the kind of larger cultural narrative that like school and higher education is a pathway towards mobility was something that had stuck with me. And so I was working in a restaurant and decided that I wanted to try community college. I had gotten my GED when I was 16 and had done a quarter of community college immediately after because it was free and my family was insistent that I needed to do it. And then I failed all of my classes because I was 16 and did not want to be in school at that time. And instead, wanted to hang out with people or go do somewhat delinquent things, And so I went back to the community college that I had gone to, at Umpqua Community College, and there was one class that fit my work schedule, and it was the sociology of race, class, and ethnicity. And at this point, I was in that mid to late 20s age and decided, I'm going to give this class a shot. And if it works out, then maybe I'll go to school. When I started community college, that it's open enrollment, but they asked me, you have to declare a major. And I tell my students this all the time, that my originally declared major was dental hygiene. Right. Dental hygiene actually is one of those degrees that the cost benefit analysis in terms of how much time you spend in school versus how much money you end up making in most places is actually a really good ratio. And so I was like, oh, then that is obviously why one goes to school, is to, pursue something that they care nothing about, but want to make money. Thankfully, sociology saved me and I never had to look at anybody's teeth because that's 100% not for me. And so I took this class and it was amazing. And it sounds very Lifetime movie, but it completely changed my life, right? Yeah. So it gave me all these concepts and ideas for kind of understanding the world around me, and particularly understanding inequality, right? Both socioeconomic and racial inequality and other forms of inequality that I really had seen in my own community growing up, growing up in the 80s and 90s in a rural working class space where there's a lot of folks that are living in pretty intensive poverty was very angering, but I didn't have a way to understand it. And this started to open up kind of these broader, larger social processes and understanding kind of how structural stratification and inequality works. I was very fortunate when I took that class. The professor, Amory Smith, was, in addition to being a grizzled old Marxist, was a non-traditional student himself, and was like, hey, you could get a PhD. And I had no idea what that meant, but I was like, that seems better than working at a restaurant. And there happened to be somebody that worked in financial aid as a work study that was also in the course, because I paid out of pocket for that class. And she was like, you're a single mom, you can get financial aid, you could go to school for free. And so, I ended up filling out my FAFSA and doing all of that, and went to community college and thrived there. There were a lot of really amazing, dedicated faculty. And it turned out I was pretty good at school once put into the situation, which I have the support and resources I need. And so I transferred from there to Reed College in Portland, Oregon. I was able to do that because I was selected for a Jack Kent Cooke scholarship. They are a large holistic scholarship organization, and they offer the largest scholarship of its kind and one of the only ones for transfer students that is of any kind of size, right? And so they have the undergraduate transfer scholarship. They have a number of scholarships, a young scholarship, the college scholarship, they've got graduate scholarships. But the undergraduate transfer scholarship it paid for my full tuition and living expenses while I was at Reed College, which is a pretty big sticker price. And once you become a scholar, you can apply for their advanced scholarships. So I received a graduate scholarship from them as well. So I went to Reed and I got my bachelor's degree in sociology, continued to love it, and was like, great, I'm totally going to get a PhD. Still didn't really fully know what that meant, but was like, this seems great. And my wife and then 2 kids and we adopted a teenage boy kind of in the process. We moved to Chicago and I went to graduate school there. And now I'm a professor, which is wild.
That's dropped out in, you said 8th or 9th grade? 9th grade.
9th grade, yeah.
And worked, difficult labor jobs. So how important was that mentor? Emory?
Yeah, Emory. Yeah, Emory is amazing. And so are a number of other mentors at Umpqua, Need again. And then also I was part of the TRIO program, which is the federally funded program for first-gen students, low-income students with different learning needs. And you get individualized advising and you can get tutoring and all of that. Yeah, so the mentorship through a number of faculty that were there, but also kind of my advisors really, I didn't even think to apply to selective colleges until my TRIO advisor said, you could apply to selective colleges. I was going to go to the University of Oregon, which is a perfectly great school, but it's a completely different trajectory than being in selective schools.
Yeah, Chicago's amazing. That's a fantastic school. I'm going to see if I have the basic landscape right. I read the story of the polishing the story as one of identity, culture, adaptation, just at a very high level. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Totally.
So there's a couple different ways I want to approach it. One is from the student's perspective, and then one is from the institutional perspective.
Right.
So from the student's perspective, maybe you can speak to this. But what are the emotional, psychological challenges that are faced by first-gen low-income students at these really amazing institutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the book really tries to kind of center around this idea. And going into the research, I had, my own experience and some kind of gut instincts about the broader process especially from talking to other Jack Kent Cooke scholars, but I didn't have the full picture at all. And, of course, right, my own experience is my own experience. That's not empirical data, right?
It's anecdote.
Yeah, a nice anecdote,
Yeah.
Whereas the book is 150 students, longitudinal interviews, right? So a little bit more than an anecdote, which is helpful. And the thing is that, right, I tried to kind of open the book and talk about the experience of students by first talking about the way that we talk about social mobility in society, right? We tend to talk about it in economic terms, just like why I chose that I wanted to for a moment there was going to be a dental hygienist, right? It's about going to school as a means to an end. And the goal is to capture social mobility, right? To capture the degree, to capture the salary, to capture the career. And we tend to talk about that as an unquestionable good as well, right? Like, why would somebody question making more money, right? Or question having a higher level of education? And what that does is that, that has fueled the expansion of college access programs and scholarships, and that's amazing. But it also creates a situation where the students I talk to and spend time with in the book, right, they head into college with them and their families, most of the time having very positive frameworks around the idea of social mobility. A lot of them are thinking about, like, I'm going to be a doctor, right? I'm going to become a doctor, not only a doctor, I'm going to become a cancer doctor so that I can come home to my community and do oncology for children. So they're thinking about their communities, they're thinking about all of these things that are going to happen. And they're pumped, right, for social mobility. And then they get to these schools, I was at highly selective and selective schools. And they get to schools and they're very, very different than the students that they go to school with, but also the environments, right? And so, I think using my own experience, when I went from rural Oregon to Reed College, which is in Portland, Oregon, and is, it's a small liberal arts college that prides itself on academic masochism and or rigor, right? But, the space was intense, just even being in buildings that were beautiful in that way. It's an unmooring experience for a lot of students. And what begins to happen for a lot of students that I found in the book is that, basically by going to schools like this, just in themselves, they are what we call people changing institutions. And they change students. That's the goal of college. And if you look at any kind of website for admissions, they talk about how they're going to change students, right? It's about intellectual exploration. It's about finding yourself, right? But what they don't talk about is how they're going to change students in very classed ways for those students that are first-gen low-income students, right? And so this happens organically through going to class, talking with professors, talking to peers, being in spaces where you're learning about, there's new types of art or food or whatever. But it also happens in a very targeted way now. And I kind of try to trace this back to the 1990s. We realized at a certain point from social scientific research that one of the things that first-gen students don't necessarily have the same amount or same type of as their peers from affluent and continuing generation families is this thing we call cultural capital, right? So it's like knowledge and skills and resources. It's about knowing who Dostoevsky is. It's about understanding interpretive dance as more than just people rolling around on the floor. It's about being able to talk about cheese in very specific ways, right? But it's also about knowing what office hours are for and feeling comfortable and confident in these spaces where there's perhaps gilded halls, et cetera, right? Colleges and universities have created programming for that for students. And that's great in terms of helping them align better with their campuses, thrive in academic and non-academic spaces. But what I found is that this becomes very surprising for students, the change that they go through, right? They're expecting it. That's not the kind of change that we talk about on admission websites, right? And so students can have these very intense realization moments, either individually or with their families and communities, where essentially all of a sudden they've changed. And it's not all of a sudden, it happens over time gradually, but we don't usually notice micro changes in ourselves in that sort of way. And this becomes really intense for students and their families, a little bit more intense than kind of normal, quote unquote, normal change that happens, general change that happens in college, because it's about people's classed identities. And so what becomes up for kind of dispute or debate or something to be guarded against is this idea that students are changing into this category of people that perhaps families and communities see as responsible for the complete desolation of an entire economy in their hometown, for instance, right? So all of a sudden you start to become part of the wealthier class, and you are those people that decided that logging shouldn't exist anymore. That becomes a very intense thing for folks. And so I find that students, they end up being kind of stuck in the situation where instead of cultural straddling or code switching, which is what we often talk about for students that are coming from underrepresented backgrounds into educational spaces, more kind of selective educational spaces, students talk about how that's actually becomes kind of impossible for them. And instead, they become trapped between two worlds, right? Because in order to be able to actually attain the social mobility that they're after and like get the promise of that college degree that they're going through, they have to change, right? But they also are being pushed and feel the need to stay authentic, right? To who they were and who their communities are. And that creates a lot of pressure for folks, but also, can create negative mental health outcomes. Students end up feeling like they need to transfer to less selective schools, or the conflict with their families becomes so bad that they, reduce contact or cut ties with them. And kind of all the while that they're doing this, they're still, studying for midterms and doing calculus P sets and trying to apply to grad schools, and also trying to afford going out for pizza or, buying a winter coat. And so kind of these
Yeah.
things that we already knew about first gen students that really impact their experiences and kind of their outcomes that we tend to measure, this kind of more socio-emotional, larger kind of cultural process, I at least make the argument that is a piece of why we continue to see outcomes for these students kind of staying statically below their peers, even with these kinds of interventions.
So statically below their new peers.
Yeah, their new peers.
Is it a binary choice, or do some students find a balance between, obviously there's some students that find a balance between, old identity and new identity. I'm wondering is this different than other kinds of uncomfortable growth? And how is it different than other kinds of uncomfortable growth?
Yeah, that's great. So, it's very much a spectrum. There are a number of students that I talk to that do just fine with this, right? They're like, this is a totally fine thing. And honestly, the amount that I'm changing isn't all that much relative to, who I am now. And, it's not really impacting me and it's not impacting my family and it's not that big of an issue. I'm just going to keep going, right? Whereas some of them are into full turmoil. And then there's a lot of people that are kind of in the middle, right? Where they try to balance the growth of their new kind of parts of their identity and the maintenance of kind of older parts of their identity and try to meld them as well as they can. Most folks talk about how difficult that is and that this kind of stuck between two worlds, right? Because it is this thing that, people changing institutions like colleges, but also like prisons, right, are designed to change you fundamentally. And you can never actually be the person you were before, right? It's back to kind of philosophical ideas of you can't step in the same river twice, right? And this is happening for general college students that are traditional age. It's happening for them in all kinds of ways because they're in adolescence already, right? And so, like you said, like, how is this different than other types of change? And I often, when I present the book, I often, get asked a question like this. And I talk about it in the best way that I know how, which is there are a lot of students that come home and are like, Mom, I'm a vegan lesbian now, and their parents, might not dig that either, right? And for different reasons, right? So if we think about all of the different kinds of levels of change that are going on, like veganism, that's just, some folks are like, that's foreign to me. I don't understand it. Why wouldn't you want to eat a hamburger? They're delicious. In terms of sexuality, that can get into people's religious beliefs, cultural beliefs, right? So that gets a little bit touchier, right? And then the class thing, right? So how I found this to be different, because of course these students are also telling me these stories, right? They're like, I am a vegan lesbian and my parents are upset about that too, right? Or that their, political views are changing. So that's a big one, right? That it's like their political views are changing. Students are learning new concepts, right? Or they're leveraging the idea of like the patriarchy towards their dad all of a sudden, right? Like these are very normal adolescent and especially college adolescent moments because, you learn new ideas, you learn new terms that maybe you didn't have in your house growing up. You bring them back sometimes to lob them at your parents to be like, I'm different, I'm older, I'm these things. But the thing about the class change that I found, and this is the argument that I try to make in the book, is I draw on Arlie Hochschild's book, Strangers in Their Own Land. And she's looking at rural Americans and kind of the experience that conservative rural Americans have. And it goes back to this idea of, when I am talking to students and they're talking to me about their parents and their families and the interactions, there's really this like classed identity piece to it that like hits at the core for a couple of reasons. One, some families, right, they get to a point and students get to a point where it's like, wait a minute, why is it that I now believe that what I'm doing is better than what my parents do or what my grandparents did, right? Like, I'm being told by this institution, and I have started to believe that working with your hands isn't good enough anymore, right? Or that doing things that are not a college degree type job or even advanced degree jobs are lesser than in some sort of way, right? And that hits on this larger cultural and social power dynamic around class and occupation and ways of life, right? That other types of adolescent change aren't hitting on. And then if you add the historical piece to it, that some families start to become concerned, right? That their child is becoming part of a class of people that have been the oppressors of their people, perhaps for generations, right? And it's not that they don't want their students to go through social mobility, and it's not that the students don't want to go through social mobility. It's that they find themselves kind of lost without a vocabulary to talk about this, right? Because as a society, we are not very transparent about the way we talk about class, right? And it all gets wrapped up in this big ball, right? That because some of it certainly is about parents feeling like they don't have control anymore in other sorts of way, right? And one of the things that is interesting that provided good evidence towards kind of why the class piece matters and why it does get wrapped up in adolescence is the students that had gone to boarding school during middle school and high school, that they faced less of this experience with their parents while they were in college because they had worked it out when they were younger at that point. And it got tied in even more closely to, oh, this person is a teenager and is hormonal and a jerk. And so kind of the status had shifted at an earlier point. And so that became an interesting kind of piece of evidence for that.
How much of the change is due to the desire for moving up social mobility, and how much of it is due to, so on the student's part or the family's part, and how much of it is due to institutions intentional providing avenues for that social mobility? Then we'll get into how we change the institutions.
Totally. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the desire is there because that's what pushes people towards school. And in the earliest chapter of the book, I talk about how students and their families make decisions about where to go to college, right? And so for first gen and low income students, the first consideration is money, right? And the students that I was talking to, these are all extremely high performing first gen and low income students. And so they are all receiving significant financial aid packages or significant scholarship support. And so for many of them, the cost piece goes off the table right away, which frees them up to then choose amongst the different schools that have provided them support. And prestige is like the next piece on, right? If money's not an issue, then prestige is where it is, right? But what's interesting is prestige, but also provability of like actually producing social mobility, not just for people, but for people like those families, right? And so there were actually some families and students that had conflict or ended up choosing to go to a school that was less prestigious because their family had never heard of the schools that they'd gotten into, right? So they get into Williams, right, which is the #1 liberal arts college in the nation. It's a great school, but a lot of first-gen families have not heard of Williams. They've heard of Harvard and they've heard of whatever their local state school is, right? And so they don't trust that that institution is actually going to provide the mobility that they say they will because there's no examples of that in their community. Whereas, there is a cousin that went to Chico State and he's an engineer now, right? And so Chico State is not as highly ranked as Williams is, but they actually have proof that it will produce mobility. So the first part is that they want the mobility, right? That's what they're doing. And they make very calculated and as informed as possible decisions. But I think that, a big part of it is the work that the institutions are doing. I think that, if it was just the students, or if it was predominantly the students' desires for social mobility, I don't think that we would see the kinds of conflict and internal kind of pain that students are facing because they would just go all in. And some students do go all in, and some students go all in and still it hurts and it is strange, right? It becomes a very weird thing to be so different from the people that you're around. And, institutions are doing this intentionally, and parts of it are unintentional. And it's not just the movement of the students towards social mobility. it's also the different movement of their communities and families, right? We have this with students that aren't necessarily first gen or part of this book, right? That a kid goes to college and then their friends from high school don't go to college, right? And that creates very different divergent tracks, right? And a number of students talk about this, that it's like, oh, I'm not only am I going to college, my friends are not going to college and their lives are so different now. People are starting to have babies or they have to work all of the time. And I'm writing papers about Herodotus or whatever. And, it makes a very different life. And then at the same time, the schools, these institutions, there's a ton of social scientific research starting in the 90s. We do these waves where we're trying to understand why are underrepresented students, both first gen students, but also students of color, why are they not doing as well as their peers, right? Their white and affluent and continuing generation peers. Why aren't they doing as well? And even at schools that have the most resources, at a Stanford, at a Harvard, right? Like, why do they have longer times to degree completion? Why do they have generally lower GPAs? Why are they more likely to drop out? Why are they less likely to major in certain majors, right? And social scientists do research in essentially three waves that come back to universities that say, first, it's that they need economic capital, right? They need more money. So we have this increase of financial aid and scholarship funding, but then they see that they still aren't performing at the same level. So, social scientists go back in and do the research again, and they come back out and they say, it's social capital, right? So they need connections and networks and resources with alumni, right? They don't have that in their families, right? They don't have families that work at Goldman, right? They don't have all of these things. They need that information. They need connections to people. So we see this huge rise of kind of the networking stuff for students, particularly underrepresented students, and it still stays pretty static in terms of their outcomes. And so social scientists, we hop back in there like we're supposed to, and we come back out and we go, you love those last two forms of capital. Man, have I got a capital for you. It's called cultural capital. And that's just the bucket that we use for everything else. That includes all of this stuff, including understanding what investments are, right? So it's like, how do you manage your financial aid, but also what is an office hour, but also do you know about Lin-Manuel Miranda and Hamilton? And do you understand what people are talking about when they talk about the south of France and all of these pieces? And that's the era we're in. And we've been in this era for about 15 years in which higher education has been more and more and more building programming and resources for students to provide them with that capital that they need in order to succeed, but also part of why they're not succeeding is because they do not have what they need to become socially mobile. And so it's this idea that it's like, it's not just about being able to do well in your, calculus course, right? But that is part of cultural capital. And so having tutoring available for folks is part of it. But it's also about being able to connect with and fit in and feel like you belong with your classmates that maybe their parents are the CEO of Coca-Cola, and being able to have the same cultural touch points as them and talk to them, but also talk to your alumni who are the ones that are going to give you jobs and start to become and look and behave and talk like an alum from those kinds of organizations do. And so this kind of polishing process is this machine now at colleges and universities across the nation. The book focuses on selective schools, but I did a follow-up study at a regional state college in the Pacific Northwest. And it turns out the same process happens at schools like that as well. It's just not to the same extreme. It's about the relative mobility that is being asked of a student. And so not all students at these state schools are going to go through this, especially if they're first gen, but their dad's a carpenter and their mom is a teacher's aide and they, live a pretty middle class life. But for the lowest income first gen students, even at kind of regional state colleges and universities, they feel the same kind of polishing process.
So I wonder, I know that you're talking specifically to first gen, you're talking specifically to elite schools, elite universities. But as you're talking, I'm reflecting my own experience. And I didn't go to an elite school. I'm not a first gen student. But I remember coming back after my freshman year and telling my parents how I studied comparative religion and I studied philosophy. I came back and I'm not a Christian anymore. I remember changing. I was raised pretty poor and now I am not. And that didn't happen in college, but it's kind of resonating a little bit with me, even though I'm probably the poster boy for the man. So 53, white, tall, male. Like I'm like every advantage, but there's still a sense of the mobility was what I wanted.
Mhm.
And I really wanted it. Like when I was 9, I knew that that's what I was going to do. I was going to be mobile. I was going to have $1 million. I was going to be right. And I was certain of that. I don't think I was polished.
Mhm.
I don't feel polished. I went to a state school, all that kind of stuff. But I still feel that there was a distance created between myself and my family growing up. Like I think that so how much of that is just supposed to happen?
Mm. That's a great question. The book has been out for almost a year, and the number of folks that I've talked to that have expressed essentially having similar, right, that they resonate with the book, even though, like you said, they come from very different, backgrounds or intersections of identity, right, is quite a bit. The book focuses on a very specific set of folks in a very specific set of contexts, but it does speak to a set of much larger processes of like what social mobility is and what social mobility does, right? And I think that one of the things that is a strength of this study is that, and we do this all the time in social science on purpose, right, is that you pick extreme examples to try and highlight like more generalizable kind of processes. And the soapbox that I get on in the book, and that, going into the project, I didn't know how to articulate it, but I just was really like, social mobility does something to people, right? This is a thing that happens to people all of the time to varying different degrees, but it does something to us, right? And we don't talk about it that way. And, I was able to produce enough data and kind of weave together these student stories to be like, here's one very extreme set of examples of this. But this is part of a larger, bigger thing that is what social mobility is. And social mobility involves an economic, a social, and a cultural component, right? Each of those components work together in a way that there are demands on each level of what they expect of a person of each kind of class status, right? As you like move your way up or down, right? For downward mobility, it's going to change people, right? That is because you start at one, even if it's just economic, right? We have all kinds of popular culture examples of how you can't just buy your way into social mobility, right? I grew up watching reruns of the Beverly Hillbillies as a kid, which is like, oh, that doesn't do well now. But like the idea is there because we still have that in contemporary media as well, that it's this idea that, you can't just buy your way into social mobility, right? Like, sure, you can get there in the space physically. You could buy a house that's very fancy and be in a nice neighborhood, but you will be an outcast and no one is going to want to be your friend. And you will never be part of the group, right? Because we have these social expectations and cultural expectations. And so, yeah, I think that this is what's supposed to happen to people when they go through social mobility. I think the question that I try to ask is like, is that fair? But that's like a philosophical question. But the more important question, right, is like, okay, then if this is what is expected and necessary and perhaps just part of what social mobility is, what do we do to better support folks and particularly students while they're on that pathway? Because there's nowhere in the world in which I would argue that I don't think students should be going through social mobility, right? Like I myself went through it. And although there are some very weird parts to it and hard parts to it, right? I get to be a professor now and I don't have to work in a factory. And that alone is enough.
Beautiful. It's a beautiful
Yeah,
thing.
it's great. It's amazing. Right. I joke with some of my friends I went to grad school with that were also first gen, it's like I can buy fancy juice now. And I'm a pretty simple person, but I love fancy juice. Uh, yeah. And so really it's about how do we support folks? What can we do from the university institutional perspective, or also, right, from scholarship organizations? What can be done to be a little bit more, not necessarily transparent, but a little bit more kind of open about this process for students and their families as they're headed into it, right? Not a doom and gloom, oh no, this is going to mess you up or change you in all these scary ways, but this is going to change you. And like, here's what to start to expect. Here's how you can get support from us. Because I think that that's, right, like producing social mobility pathways for folks is a deeply important thing. But just like other folks have argued, you can't just let people into college without supporting them once they get there. You can't just open the pathway towards social mobility without supporting people once they're on it.
Yeah. So it's really critical to have the three elements, the financial, the social, and the cultural, and to educate people about those three things as they're going in. You can expect this. Like, hello, it's going to be hard and you're going to change.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, it's having gone to these kinds of schools and being on a Mindful Money podcast, they focused far too heavily on the social and cultural. And like, I had money in order to pay my bills, but I think that was a piece of it that, I'm very fortunate. My wife and I bought a house a few years ago, but I was like, I have no idea how to do this. Nobody in my family can talk to me about this. I don't know what I'm doing. And to the point that I even looked to see if there was a workshop in my like alumni office for my college about it. And there wasn't, because it was like, so the internet was who helped me out.
Yeah. I mean, that is the purpose of Mindful Money, is to provide that kind of space. So we'll talk about that later. So let's pretend for a second you're talking to a family. They've got a first-gen college student, and you are telling them that they need to prepare for the polishing experience. What's one thing that they can do to prepare for the polishing experience?
I think that the one thing that they can prepare, that they should or could prepare for the polishing experience, is to have open communication. I think that one of the things that I found is that because students are often the only one from their community going through this, parents are often the only one from their community going through this, they don't necessarily feel that they have the right or comfort to talk to folks on campus about what they're going through. And so there's a lot of silence that goes on. I spend a lot of time thinking about what are kind of low cost interventions for schools that don't have a ton of resources. And I think that producing lines of communication with students and their families, but also helping students learn how to communicate with their families and vice versa, can go a really long way towards this, right? Because I think that trying to navigate it alone is way too difficult. But also, right, I think that from the kind of hitting on the other pieces of what's going on here is this kind of adolescence and movement and all of that kind of as a latent function ends up, kind of helping on that end as well, between students and parents. Now, that doesn't mean you have to tell your parents everything that's going on with you, is what I would say to the college kid, right? Like, I think communicating is the first piece of it, and like being flexible, right? Because that's what it's going to demand of you, is to be flexible, right? That this is going to demand flexibility in a lot of ways that are uncomfortable.
Yeah. The thing to do is communication, flexibility. What's one thing that they should be careful maybe to avoid doing?
The thing that they should be careful to avoid doing, I think it is like making snap decisions in reaction to what you're experiencing, right? I think a lot of students, and then myself included, in these moments of kind of like, oh no, who am I now? What have I done? Folks will try to overcorrect, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that can lead to very funny things. Like, when I was in graduate school, I kind of one day was like, oh, who is this J. Crew person? What am I doing? What's going on? And I was a graduate TA, and I showed up to class in a pair of like ripped jean shorts and a Led Zeppelin tie-dyed t-shirt at the University of Chicago, right? Because I was like, no, I'm going to hold on to my working class identity, which was like a totally wild situation, right? And I think that for the students as well, they, in the book, kind of more meaningfully, as opposed to my kind of more flashy moment, would be like, I'm just going to cut ties from people all of a sudden, right? I'm going to stop talking to people. I'm going to stop attending certain like classes, or stop, being part of student groups or things like that, right? Or stop talking to my siblings because of these kind of overcorrections in different directions, right? And, and part of that is because of not having anybody to talk to, right? Folks are like, the only thing I can do is like, I can control this one piece, which is who I talk to or what I do. Because there's also schools, although they give a ton of capital to students, they don't have any programming for how to manage that. And so, yeah, I think that it's like, think everything through. Don't make any snap decisions.
Deep breaths.
Take the deep breaths.
Just before we wrap up, I always like to come back to a personal question, and it's always the same question. People hear it as a zinger. It's not intended as a zinger. What was the last thing you changed your mind about?
Ooh, what was the last thing I changed my mind about? Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I guess like technically the last thing I changed my mind about was what I was going to eat for lunch today. Yeah. I know. It's so interesting. I wanted to go big. I was like, what is a big thing I changed my mind about? It's like, no, actually, the last thing I changed my mind about is whether I was going to bring my leftovers with me and eat them before the podcast. And I did.
You did. Good.
Yeah.
That's good. I like eating the leftovers. So finally, how can people connect with you? Where do they find you? And where do they find the book?
Yeah, so the book is available pretty much anywhere. Your favorite local bookstore, the University of Chicago Press, or whatever online retailer you're a fan of. I am on Blue Sky. I'm M. Osborne Soch. And you can also find me on LinkedIn under my name. And yeah, I'm pretty Googleable, unfortunately, I guess. If you want to read some really embarrassing interviews back from when I was an undergrad getting scholarships, it's all out there on Google.
Oh, I'm going to go through that now. Thank you so much for being on the Mindful Money podcast. I really appreciate it. I love I don't love the concept. I love the description of the concept and the work you're doing. I think it's important stuff.
Yeah, this was amazing. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening. Full show notes for each episode, which includes a summary, key takeaways, quotes, and any resources mentioned, are available at mindful.money. Be sure to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And if you're enjoying the content and getting value from these episodes, please leave us a rating and review at ratethispodcast.com/mindfulmoney. We'll be sure to read those out on future episodes.